friends, it's Christy. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be making a card using Lawn Fawn's Simply Celebrate More Critters, Two Can Do It, Would You Be Mine, Berry Rainy Day, and Ahoy Matey. So I've stamped those images out on Spectrum Noir Ultra Smooth Premium White cardstock with Lawn Fawn Jet Black ink. And before I get into the coloring, I just wanted to mention that this is for our current Lawn Fanatics Challenge, which is a bingo board. I decided to go from the top left to the bottom right. So I'm doing paper trimmer, critter, birthday, ink blending, and glitter. So I will be coloring with my Copic markers, and I'm going to start with my elephant. I'm going to be using some warm grays for him today. So I'm using W00, W1, W3, and W5. Starting with that W5 and laying in some shadows on the inner part of the trunk where it is curved upward, and then on the lower part of the ear, and then under the head on the body, and on the edges of the feet. And then I'm blending that out with the W3. I'm going to fill in most of the rest of the body with the W1, filling in the trunk and most of the ear, or all of the ear, and the lower part of the body as well. And I only saved a little bit of room for the W00 right around the eye to keep that nice and bright, but if you wanted to use only 3 shades, you could just leave that one off. Then I'm going to darken up this combo by keeping that W5 and adding in W7 and W9, and I'm going to use that for the black parts of my toucan and also the black spots on my jaguar. And since they are right beside each other and the areas that I'm coloring on both of them is pretty small, I'm just going to do both of them at the same time rather than having to switch back and forth between my markers. But I started with that W9 for the darkest, blended out with the W7, and then filled in with the W5. And having that W9 in there does really make them look black because it is such a dark, rich color. I'm also going to add black to the edges of my butterfly wings. I think it just will give them a little bit of a more dynamic look and also bring some of that color pop towards the upper parts of the card, just so there's like little spots of the black here and there. Then I'll move on to my monkey, and I'm going to go with E30s for him. I'm using E33, E35, and E37 for his fur. So I started with the E37, laid in some shadows. I'm making sure that the highlight will be on the top of his head and the top of his tail, since that's what would be catching the light. Blended out with the E35, filled in with the E33, and then I'll do his face and ears with E30 and E31. So a little E31 first, and then blending out with the E30. Then I'm going to skip over to my jaguar, and I'm going to use YR20, YR21, and YR23 so I can get a nice rich golden shade. So I'm starting with the YR23, blending out with the YR21, and just carefully coloring around those black areas. I don't want to drag that black into the golden shades, so just being careful there. I did leave the muzzle white, and I'm going to transition into that using Y000 or Y000. Then I'm moving on to my sloth. I'm going to use E70s for him. I really like the E70s for sloths. I've got E70, E71, and E74 for the fur. So I started with the E74, blended out with the E71, and then used the E70. I also filled in the face with the E70, and then the patches around the eyes are typically darker on a sloth, so I brought in the E77 for that. And then I'm going to go back to my toucan. I'm going to use BG10, BG11, and BG13 for the area around his eye. And then I do want to have this aqua blue shade in a few other places, so I'm going to color the lizard with these shades. starting with the BG13 down at the bottom and then blending up with the BG11, filling in the legs with that, and then adding a little BG10 at the very top. And I will also color the bottom part of my butterfly wings just using the two darkest shades because it was such a small area to color. Then I'm going to move on to red. I'm using R22, R24, and R29. I'll do the next part of the toucan's beak. And I'm also going to do my hibiscus flowers. I thought about doing those in different shades because hibiscus do come in multiple shades, but in the end I just decided that I wanted them to be the same because I'm going to have so many different colors on this card already. So I'm adding the R29 toward the center where the stamen is, and then blending toward the tips of the petals with the R24, and then using the R22 on the very edges. And I really like how that looks. It makes the center part look more concave because it's darker and more shadowed there. And then I'm also going to do the top of my parrot in red and kind of blend two different colors together. So I'm starting at the top of the head with the R29 and blending down toward the breast and the wing with the R24 and the R22. And then for the lower part of the parrot, I'm going to use blue. I'm going to use B23, B24, and B26. And again, I started at the opposite end with the darkest and blended with the lightest shade where the two meet. And then I just went back and forth between that R22 and the B23 to get those to blend a little bit more seamlessly. And then to have that blue somewhere else on the card, I decided to do the other two flowers, but I'm going to do it in the reverse of the way that I did the hibiscus. This time I'm putting the darkest shade, the B26, on the outer part of the petal, blending out with the B23, and then leaving the center white. And then for the next part of my toucan, I'm using orange, YR04, YR07, and YR09. I'll color the very center of my blue flowers with that shade and also the top part of my butterfly's wings. So for the center parts of the flowers, I only used the darkest and the lightest, but for the butterfly's wings, I did use all three shades. And for the stripes on the lizard's back, I use the lighter two shades. So YR07 blended out with YR04. Then I'm going to move on to a brighter yellow. I'm using Y13, Y15, and Y17 to finish off the toucan's beak. I'll also do the little circles on the butterfly's wings and the stamens on the hibiscus flowers. Just starting with the Y17, blending out with the Y15, and finishing with the Y13. For the little frog, I'm using YG00, YG01, and YG03, just so he's a little bit of a lighter shade because I wanted him to stand out from the leaves that I'm going to do. So for those, I am going to darken up this combo and add in the YG05, and I took away the lightest, and I'll do some of the leaves in this combo. So YG05 at the base of the leaf, blended out with YG03, and then using the YG01 at the tip of the leaf. And then for the other leaves, I'm going to darken it up and keep the YG05, but add in YG07 and YG09. That way it's still in the same family, so I know they're going to look right together, but it'll just be a little bit more of a contrast look on the card. And by the way, while I am coloring this panel, I'm also doing that separate panel that I showed you at the beginning off screen because it was the same colors that I used on this card. I'm going to add rosy cheeks to all of my critters using R11 and R20. Just a little R20 first, and then blending out with the R11, just going right around the edges to soften that into their fur or skin tone. For the grasses, I decided to go with a darker green. I'm using G21, G24, and G28, G28 down at the base, and then blending up toward the top, toward where the sun would be hitting with the G24 and then the G21. And then for the fern style leaf, I'm going to stay in the same family. I took away the G28 and added in the G20. I'm doing this one a little bit different. I just colored in the leaves solid with the G20, and then I'm adding in a little bit of the G21, and then I'll add even less of the G24. Just gives the leaves a little bit of a different look. And for the other leaf, I'm going to use YG11, YG13, and YG17. Although in the end card I didn't end up using this leaf. It just didn't work where I thought it would. So this one is the only image that I did not end up using on the final card. But for the leaf, I just started with the YG17 down the center and also at the bottom of each little separated part of the leaves, and then blended out with the YG16, and then use the YG11 for the highlight. And I just colored like in little circular motions to break up any harsh lines and try to get the smoothest blend as I could. And then for the wood log, I'm using E53, E55, and E57. A little E57 down at the bottom, and then I'm also outlining all of the drawn lines on there just to emphasize that wood grain texture and create some grooves to give it, you know, that depth and dimension. And then I'll blend that out with the E55, and then I'll use the E53 for the highlight at the top, just making sure to blend over that a bit so it's nice and smooth. And then I'll also add a little of that E53 to the cut end and blend that out with the E51. Then I'm just going to take a black Sakura jelly roll pen and get that going off to the side. Mine is super old and it doesn't like to flow very well anymore. I do have a new one, but for whatever reason I keep using this old one. But I'm going to go over the eyes of all of my critters that have their eyes open, which just makes them nice and bright and shiny, adds a little bit of texture to it, and is a nice finishing look. Then I'll bring in my additional sheet of images and trim them all out with their matching dies. For my background, I'm taking a piece of Bristol smooth surface cardstock and sticking that down to my Waffle Flower 6x6 grip mat, and then over top of that I'm going to layer the Lawn Fawn birch tree stencils. I'm just using one of those layers and trying to get that smoothed down as much into place as I can. The grip mat holds it really well on the sides, but the part that goes over the cardstock is still super flexible, so I have to hold it down with my hand as well. So I'm blending on some Twisted Citron Distress Oxide ink and trying to create a bit of like a rainforest look. I want there to be some trees in the distance, but just to have this overall green look, like there's just so much leaves and foliage there that it just has that greenish cast to it. So I started with the Twisted Citron, and then I'm going to bring in some mowed lawn to darken up the top and the bottom, because that would be where more of the leaves are up above in the canopy, and then also down below on the ground where there would be like bushes and grasses and things. So I'm adding the mowed lawn at the top and the bottom, and then I will go back to the Twisted Citron and just blend that out toward the center again. And I'm leaving a little bit in the very center that's a bit more patchy, just to give it like kind of like a sunlight coming through, like that kind of look. So I'll go back and forth until I have a look that I am liking. And then once I'm happy with that, I will peel up the stencil and you can see how that's looking. It didn't give a perfect impression. I got a little bit of ink underneath on a couple of those trees, but that's okay because it is going to be more of that kind of hazy look, and I am going to distress this quite a bit as well. First, I'm going to add some water onto an acrylic block, mix that up with a very fine paintbrush because I wanted to keep my droplets on the small side, And I'm going to splatter that all over that focal panel so I get like little spots of light here and there, like little flecks of floating light almost, like the sun dappling through the leaves. And then I'll blot that up with a paper towel. And then I decided that I wanted to add a little bit more at the top. I had more down at the bottom, but not as much of that splatter effect at the top. So I did that a second time, and then I'll blot that up once again. And then I'm going to distress that even further by adding some of those inks onto the block as well. So I've got both the Twisted Citron and the Mowed Lawn, adding a bit of water to that and then mixing it up and splattering that. I like to start with the lighter shade first. That way I don't need to clean my brush in between uses. I can just go from the lighter shade to the darker shade. And because I'm using that very, very fine paintbrush, the splatter detail is like super fine, which is what I wanted on this card. I just wanted to have, I don't know, just more of like a softer fleck in the background. So I'm going to do that until I like the way it's looking, and then I will set that aside to dry. But then I decided that I didn't like the trees extending all the way down to the ground, because when I add my logs with my critters on top, it would look like they were standing on top of white trees. So I decided to add some more of that mowed lawn down at the bottom to make it look a bit more like grass and shrubbery down there. You could also use a grass die cut and add that down at the bottom, which I think would look nice, but I knew that hardly any of it was going to show, so this was just the faster way to do it. So next I'm going to work on my sentiment, and I'm going to use the giant Happy Birthday to You die and trim that out of some wood grain light brown cardstock and also some chocolate bar cardstock, both from Lawn Fawn. And then I'm going to carefully pop these die cuts out of the cardstock. I love that the entire thing stays together. You don't have any loose letters. So that really helps, especially if you want to do like a drop shadow like I'm doing. It just makes the whole process a lot easier. So once I have those separated out, I'm going to take my Barely Art Precision Craft Glue, because it has that super fine nozzle. And I'm making sure to add just the tiniest amount of glue on the right hand side of each part of the letters. That way my drop shadow can show on the left. So I'm just trying to be consistent with that and not add too much so it doesn't just squeeze out all over the place. And like I said, I just love that I have this super fine nozzle so that I can really place that glue carefully, because otherwise die cuts like this could be a big mess. So I'm going to place the wood grain version on top, so it almost looks like tree bark to kind of go along with the trees and stumps that I colored, and then the drop shadow will be the chocolate bar cardstock. So I want to stamp on the inside of my card before I get too much further here, and I am using Lawn Fawn's Noble Fir ink and stamping on Noble Fir cardstock. So it's the matching ink to the cardstock, but I am stamping twice to make sure it's nice and bold. And then I used my paper trimmer to trim down this focal panel to just be slightly smaller than the card front. I took a 1/4 inch off of each side, so we get that nice dark green border on the edges. And then I can bring in my images. I want to create the look of one long log for my critters in their row to kind of sit on top. So I'm going to glue those together so that they are overlapping a little bit, and I am doing it right on my card base because I wanted to make sure that it was the right length for the focal panel. So I'm just adding that, and I'm not worried about the extra little stem that's sticking up because it's going to be behind the critters anyway. Then I just added a very thin bead of glue to the bottom of that row of critters, and I'm attaching that on the top of the logs. And then to make that look a little bit more cohesive, I'm going to grab my E53 marker and just color in the white edge beneath the critters' paws and feet so that it looks a little bit more blended in with the rest of the log. Then I added some foam tape to the back of that, so I'll just peel off those release papers, and then I can pop that up on the bottom of the card and give those critters a little bit of dimension. That also creates a little bit more separation between them and the stenciled trees and kind of makes the forest look like it's pushed a little bit further back in the scene. I also took the time to cut down a bunch of tiny little thin strips of foam tape so that I could pop up this large sentiment because I just wanted to have that dimension on there as well. I'm going to tuck the larger tree branch right above the sentiment, making sure that the leaves don't cover up any of the letters so you can still read it. And then I'll do the smaller tree branch on the opposite side and just trim off the excess with my Cutter Bee Teflon coated scissors. Then I'll add the lizard to the large tree branch up at the top and my parrot to the smaller tree branch. And just start filling in this scene. So my original idea was to have these leaves down at the bottom, kind of covering up the gap between the two logs so that it really looked more like one. But they ended up being just a little bit too long. The fern style leaves I was able to trim down a bit and still have them look okay, especially when I add some other elements in front. But this other leaf, I just couldn't get it to work. It had to be trimmed down because it was too long by itself, but it just didn't look right there in the gap. So I had to pivot a bit and I decided to add some grasses in front instead. And I did the same trick with that E53 marker and just colored in the white line to make it look less obvious. And then added the grass down at the bottom. I also added another little patch of grass at the base of the cut leaf to hide that cut edge. And because this fern style leaf does have the stem in the center, it was easier to trim that one down and still have it look okay if you covered up the bottom. But that larger, broader leaf, it just didn't look right. So that's why I ended up not using it on the card. At first I thought maybe I would add it at the top corner, and while it looked okay there, I felt like it was kind of weird to have just one big leaf at the top and no others. So I added the little frog to the center of the O in the word to, and then I'm filling in some of the empty little areas with the butterflies on the sides and just balancing those out by putting one on the left and one on the right so that they're kind of diagonally across from each other. I also added tiny little bits of foam tape behind all of these leaves, and I wanted to have these leaves kind of coming off of the sentiment so that it almost looks like it's, you know, a tree that's growing there, the sentiment. So just adding like those little leaves sticking out of it here and there to kind of fill in some of the gaps and just make it look a bit more vibrant and alive. So again, I just tried to balance those out and make sure that they were kind of spread apart from each other, and also to kind of turn the leaves in a slightly different direction from each other so that they didn't look too similar when they were close by. So I'm going to add one more of those little patches of leaves there between happy and birthday, and then I'm going to dot the eye with one of the blue flowers. And I'll add a hibiscus down toward the bottom in that little cluster just to bring some of that vibrant color down toward the lower part of the scene as well. I added another one on the opposite side to balance it out, and since I had one extra, I decided to add that in the center, right where that little patch of grass is. Then I took the other blue flower and decided to have it kind of growing off the top edge of the Y because it wouldn't cover up too much of the sentiment that way. And then I just adjusted the leaves that were behind it so they stuck out a little bit further. And then I just had one little cluster of green leaves left, so I added that down in the center near that third hibiscus. And then the only thing that was left on my bingo board was glitter, which is no problem for me because I love to add glitter to my cards. So I'm using some sawdust stickles and I'm adding that to the edges of my butterfly wings, to the centers of my flowers, to the stripes on my lizard. I also did it to the little circles on the butterfly's wings. And that's it. I didn't want to go too overboard since this card was more gender neutral. I wanted to have it be for either. But there, I will lift that up so you can see all of that detail and give you another peek at the inside. If you guys enjoyed this one, please be sure to hit that like button and leave me a comment. I'd love to hear from you. Subscribe if you haven't already, and ring that notification bell if you want to be alerted whenever I post new videos. If that bingo board sounds like fun to you, you can participate using the link down below, and that is also where I will have all of the links to the supplies that I used in case you'd like to pick up anything for yourself. I'll also add 2 extra videos here on screen in case you'd like to continue watching. And thank you so much for spending your time with me today. I really hope you had a good one, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye-bye.